Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined today by Professor Vanessa K. Valdés, Interim Dean of the Macaulay Honors College at the City University of New York, as well as a professor of Spanish and Portuguese. She's the former director of the Black Studies program at the City College of New York, CUNY. She's the author of several books, Ocean's Daughters, The Search for Womanhood in the Americas, published by Suny Press, 2014. One of our favorites, Diasporic Blackness, The Life and Times of Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, which was published by Suny, 2017. She's also the editor of the volume The Future Is Now, a new look at African diaspora studies, published by Cambridge Scholars in 2012. Let the Spirit Speak, Cultural Journeys Through the African Diaspora, published by Suny Press, also in 2012. But she joins us here today to talk about her latest edited volume, Racialized Visions, Haiti and the Hispanic Caribbean, published by Suny Press as part of the Afro-Latinx Futures series, which is edited by Professor Valdés. Of Racialized Visions, April J. Mays, author of Mulatto Republic, writes, "This is a timely, well-conceived, and important contribution to the growing efforts of scholars, activists, and artists in the United States to think across and work through disciplinary, linguistic, and historical boundaries that have traditionally separated the study of Haiti from the rest of the Caribbean, particularly the Spanish-speaking Caribbean." How are you doing today, Vanessa?
I am ecstatic. I am so very happy to join you. I had no expectation that I would make a return to Left of Black. And as I've expressed to you, when people learn about me, more often than not, it is because of my first appearance on this show. So thank you so much for having me back.
You're welcome. You begin this book, writing about the influence of a figure like Edwidge Dantes, placing Haiti in conversation with these other nations in the region, that it seems that there was some sort of disconnect. Beginning with Dantes, talk a little bit about the roots of this project. What drew you to having this conversation about the Spanish-speaking relationship to Haiti in this moment?
So there were several things. I had been asked to review Miriam Shansi's From Sugar to Revolution back now a decade ago. That book came out in 2012. And it is a book in which that she talks about women's novels from the writers themselves are Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba, right? And for me, that was an interesting configuration. And then she, in the first 50 pages of that book, really laid out how Latin American studies as a discipline is in general an anti-Black space, and specifically an anti-Haitian space, and uses Haiti as the example. And to that moment, it's such a convincing reckoning, right? And very well thought out. And that I, as a reviewer, I had to review the rest of the book, right? But, and I did wind up writing that review, but that rocked me and resonated so deeply, because when I was writing Oshun's Daughters, and I would talk about that project, people would ask me if I had included voodoo in there, if I had included women writers who had included voodoo, who included figures like Ersuli. And I had said no, one, because I hadn't been trained in that way, and two, I have deep respect for that system of as a religion, as an epistemology. And so I'm not going to just dibble dabble with that. Yeah. And so it really caused a great deal of self-reflection, because what I have come to realize is that for me, thinking of myself as an eternal student gives me permission to do what I have done in grad school. I think a lot of times people kind of go back to their training and they stay there, right? And they don't allow themselves a deepening of just learning, continued learning. And so that's how I move, right? With every project I do, it is to stretch myself, it's to challenge myself as a scholar, as a writer, as a student. And so that was the first moment. So I said, okay. The next thing was when I was writing Diasporic Blackness, because I was writing about Arturo Schomburg, and Arturo Schomburg collected on Haiti and wrote about Haiti, to the extent that when he passed away, one of his closest friends was Dantes Bellegarde, who I write about here,
Mm-hmm.
who was the former ambassador from Haiti to the United States during the US military occupation on that island, on that nation from 1915 to 34. And he said that Arturo Schomburg knew more about Haiti than any person he had known who wasn't Haitian.
Okay.
And so then we have those two things come together. And when I was writing Diasporic Blackness, I had in my conclusion, in the original manuscript, a section on Haiti. And both readers were very supportive of that manuscript, but one explicitly said, that's confusing. You have to take that out. And so I was like, well, there's its own project.
It's the next project, right?
And so those two things came together. And then as far as Edwige Dantica, she is someone that certainly, both in the work that she has done in her fiction, and perhaps more for me, the work that she does on the pages of the New Yorker, the work that she does in her nonfiction, to constantly give voice to what is happening in Haiti, is so critical, because I don't know how anyone can pretend to not know when Edwige Dantica is alive, right? And always including different voices. So, and she's not the only one, but there is a woman who uses her position she recognizes the responsibility that comes with it.
Right. And the platform that she has,
and uses it responsibly. So all of those things came together.
I mean, you start the book with a big question, right? What does it mean to place Haiti at the center of so many of the political, social, and cultural energies that come from that region? Talk a little bit about the way that, Haiti has been utilized and misutilized by white elites, for all kinds of different historical reasons, to almost portray, for lack of a better way to describe it, almost Haiti is like a duppy state, right? Something that is a danger, right? Almost has a ghost-like quality in the area, in the region, and folks are encouraged, right, from engaging it, discouraged from engaging in any real significant way.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's to delve into the history of this hemisphere, we have to start with that island, right? And so as a Latin Americanist, for example, when I ask students what the name of that island is that currently we know as being shared by the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and they say Hispaniola, right? And I go, well, that's actually La Española. And when we say La Española, then one hears that it's Spanish. So Canary Islands, is that, and then they kind of go, oh, I said, right, that's a colonized language. Let's colonizers, let's try again. And then I say, no, the original indigenous name of that island is Haiti. Like that is actually the name of that island. In which case, when we think about what happens in 1804, when they declare the name of that island to be Haiti, they are reclaiming an indigenous presence. So when we start with in 1492, right, Columbus goes to a bunch of places. He does not go to mainland the United States. He goes to the Caribbean and he hits that island. And so, when we think about, again, just American large A, we have to start with the Caribbean and specifically that island. And then we move forward into that revolution, into, everything that we see in terms of, proxy wars that are happening, they're being fought in Europe, but then the ramifications impacts the Caribbean, right? Which has impact today, whatever designations are now happening in the world, but it's still the same thing: developed versus underdeveloped, first, third, second, main, global south, whatever. What we recognize is there are countries on one side of the world, usually in the global north and Western Europe, that then impact the entire world. So vaccines are one example, or lack thereof.
Yeah.
And so, but the Caribbean is a tryout space for Europe. And that island, again, when we think about 1791 to 1804, and we think about the complexities of Blackness as well, right? And think about histories that have been lost. So for example, everything is happening in France and people are rising up and they depose the monarch and they do all the things and they want rights, right? This is liberté, fraternité, égalité. It's happening. And men of color in the nation of Saint-Domingue, right? On the colony of Saint-Domingue, they want to participate. Not because they want rights for everyone.
Right.
They want to be part of the enfranchisement, right?
Right.
They want to be on par, right, with the French. And so, but that starts it up. And so we have 13 years of fight it then winds up being that, yes, an enslaved population together with, free people of color rise up and depose the European power. And then are surrounded by whole nations, including the colony next door called Santo Domingo. And that is all, they're surrounded by slave-holding populations, right? So they become a very special space. And then they have to fight for their lives, for the rest of its existence. And so for me, when we think about, for example, here in the United States, we may touch on the French Revolution. We really focus on the US Revolution. But we don't think about soldiers who came from that island who fought as part of the US Revolution. We don't think about the first constitutions of that island where to be free was defined as being Black, nègre, capital N. And so if those of us who continue to see how freedom is explicitly and implicitly defined as an attribute of whiteness, if we start in political theorizing with what if it was Black in this hemisphere, because of course, when we African continents may or may not start, they're doing those scholars of African histories are starting with their own pre-colonial starting points. But in this hemisphere, right, what if we elevate, we as a whole, because certainly specialists of the Haitian Revolution in particular, they do this, your colleagues that do this really well. But if it was just common history, if in 8th grade we learned about the Haitian Revolution, how would that change what we think about this world?
When you think about Haiti's relationship to these particular nations, Cuba, Puerto Rico, not a nation, of course, but and of course the Dominican Republic, the most intimate relationship is with the Dominican Republic, right? They share a landmass. But the kind of conservative contemporary politics that come out of the Dominican Republic right now, that when you think about that relationship, it's always in the context of anti-Blackness. Right, that the Dominican Republic is anti-Black and thus anti-Haitian in that context. The book explores much more of a complex dynamic there, right? Why is it we're so easy to connect anti-Blackness to the Dominican Republic? And what is a deeper history that actually counters our understanding of that relationship in this moment?
Right, and certainly given post-2013, when the constitutional decision that essentially then removed rights of Dominicans of Haitian descent. Right? And that's a distinction, right? Because people think, oh, these are Haitians that were living in the Dominican Republic. No, these are Dominicans,
right?
Whose nationality was removed going back generations. And so, that it's a really interesting thing when I explain it to students, or I ask them to think about this. I start on a human level. I start on the fact that when we are in family, right, we try to distinguish ourselves, right? I'm not my mom, I'm not my dad, I'm not my siblings, I'm not my cousin, I'm not, right? And in the process of individuation, you get through what you are not, right? Haiti does not define itself in contradistinction to the DR. The Dominican Republic, absolutely, and certainly the elites of that country, certainly post-unification of that country in 1822 to 1844, that was an infiltration of thought that absolutely repudiated those neighbors next door, right? And so what we talk about in my classes, I am in New York City, and when I was at the City College of New York, my classes were mostly populated by Dominicans who, not only shocking to most people if they don't know Dominicans, but these were Dominicans and Dominican Americans who were very clear about their African heritage, were very clear about, distinguishing between Santo Domingo, between the capital, between what is happening on that level and how people are actually living in the rest of the country, particularly as the move closer to the border, right? These are folks who, there is a widespread acknowledgement of not only shared history, shared heritages, shared bloodlines, shared music, shared everything. It is then, it is the question of what are the strategies that are happening in the capital, right? It's the same way that if people are judging Idaho by what New Yorkers are publishing on Idaho.
Right.
That's exactly what it is. It's the idea of people don't know and they're not interested in knowing, right? Because we're still talking about questions of class, not only race and ethnicity, but class as well. And all of those intersections. And so what I hoped in the selection of these essays, particularly those that concern the Dominican Republic, was, again, just to deepen that, what we think of as broad strokes. I taught a class on Dominican film a few years back, and I started with Skip Gates' Black in Latin America in that episode. And I had Dominican students who were horrified. And I said, this is an example of imagery that is happening around your country.
Right. And
people who don't know, who are learning about Blackness in Latin America,
right,
and may never talk to a Dominican.
Right.
And from there, we had whole conversations about imagery, about cultural production, means of production, all of those things. And so, it is a question also of lots of different, it's a questions of pipelines, it's a questions of who's writing the books, who selects it's all of it, right? Oftentimes. So no, I mean, I think it is, I'm deeply, the fact that I live in New York is a blessing because I get to access that kind of complexity.
Yeah. What was it like trying to find contributors for this collection?
It was easy. So here's what happens. This book again started years ago, and the first iteration of it was when I was the book review editor of SXLon, right, the digital journal of small acts out of Columbia University, and I just put a call out, and I was pretty certain that I would get more responses than that little space would afford me, and so that was a discussion section. I think contributors had maybe 1,000 words at most. Okay. And so, as I suspected, I could publish 4, but I got around 12. And so from there it was, and there we have it. There's a book.
Right. There's the book.
And so that's what I did.
One of the chapters that is of interest to me is Philip Kaisery's chapter on the Haitian Revolution and the film The Last Supper. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, Philip is amazing. So that is a book where The Last Supper, La Última Cena, is a Cuban film filmed in the era of the Cuban Revolution, right? It's the 1960s. And so it incorporates imagery of the Haitian Revolution and then explicitly connects those two revolutions, right? And again, as a kind of, that is an example of the Haitian Revolution being inspiring to peoples throughout the hemisphere, but particularly within the Caribbean. And so, yeah, I mean, it is one of the few films where, I think in this country, there's been a certain saturation of images regarding enslaved peoples in the last few, saturation. And there's a fatigue around that representation.
Right.
But then people are surprised to see films that do that in other contexts. Right. And so, I mean, of course, it is explicitly to give credence to a Cuban revolution by recalling a history of uprising by drawing on Haiti.
You mentioned earlier your contribution is a chapter on the work of Dantes Bellegarde, who, as you mentioned, is a Haitian ambassador, U.S., gives these 4 lectures in what is Puerto Rico in 1936. It's an interesting moment in Puerto Rican history because of the nationalist movement, figures like Pedro Abizo Campos, and the violence that's going on. And he makes certain kinds of explicit claims in his speeches. What struck me about this chapter and your work more broadly, we've talked about this, when he retires, right, he goes and teaches at Atlanta University, right? There's this profile of him written by Mercer Cook, right, and Phylon, right, which is a journal that Du Bois launches, at Atlanta University. There's a way in which we think about a kind of provincialism about HBCUs and Black studies in general in that period. And your work continuously undermines that thought, that these are folks who are thinking much more expansively about Black identity, about global identity, right? To the extent that someone like Du Bois would say, well, yeah, let's get Bellegarde here to as a visiting scholar. So talk a little bit about your chapter in Dante's Belgrade, if you will.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for putting a spotlight on my focus on HBCUs, because truly, I think that is such an understudied space with regards to French studies, Latin American studies, all of the studies, just all of them.
Right. Because there's no Black studies then, right? So folks are doing race in these area studies places.
Right. No, and so to this day, I have always told folks who do diaspora studies within the field of literary studies, go to the College Language Association. We know about the MLA, but if you want to talk about what we as communities do, you go to the Black organization that has got you, meaning that we continue to have diaspora scholars who work in literature, in history, and the Association of Black Women Historians, go there, right? We create our own. And so when we talk about, legacies of such things, the institutionalizations, right, of such forms, right? Your conversation regarding Nellie McKay recently, a huge fan of that book. Same thing, right? What we do for ourselves. That was a sidebar. So Dante's Belgrade. Dante's Belgrade was a very vocal opponent of the US invasion and occupation of Haiti. And so again, this is a very outside of specialists of that island, certainly even within Dominican studies, they don't talk about the 8 years that the Marines were occupying the DR. And that was 12 years, excuse me, 16 to 28, I think is there in the DR. They start in Haiti in 1915. And so there for 19 years, the Marines are in Haiti. Peter James Hudson has a fabulous book about this. Right. This is also a moment, again, when you see James Weldon Johnson is going down there as the head of the NAACP. He's reporting on that occupation. It is being reported in the crisis. It's, this is a moment in which, again, the idea of certainly an African-American audience not well aware of what's happening globally that is such an untruth. It is a blatant lie, because African-Americans were always, and also folks in the diaspora knew what was happening in the United States, right? So so it's always interesting to me to really underscore those connections. And so after being a vocal critic of the United States decides, certainly after James Weldon Johnson's series of articles, they decide to withdraw. They go back to the Marines withdraw, leaving devastating legacies on both sides of that border. And 2 years later, Dante's Belgrade visits Puerto Rico. And at the time, Puerto Rico is, they are not yet a Commonwealth officially. That happens in the 50s, right? You have Pedro Albizu Campos is rising up. He's the president of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, which is vocally calling for independence, it is the police in Puerto Rico are essentially, they are armed by the United States. The governors are put in place by the United States, right? And so this becomes, certainly San Juan, Ponce, the big cities, they become police states to a certain extent, because there is severe repression of the independence movement on that island. And so it was interesting to me that not only is he invited to go to the University of Puerto Rico, but also what he says explicitly in those lectures and what he doesn't, right? Because he is a guest of that university, but this is not an independent space, right? And so that's the tenor of my essay is really both looking at what is said and then the silences.
Right.
given the context of what's happening.
Right. Because he's using Haiti as a repository to talk about Puerto Rico when he can't talk about Puerto Rico. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so those, at first, like those lectures are very much kind of an introduction of Haiti.
Yeah.
The other fascination for me is this idea that, again, people they understand Haiti and the DR, right? They share the same islands. That's fine.
Right.
Less people know about Haiti and Cuba, which is a fascinating space, right? Given that certainly Eastern Cuba has tens of thousands of Haitian descendants in Oriente, right? And so, and there's, fascinating history that, again, Cubanists don't look at, right? Many Cubanists look at. And that much less Puerto Rico. And then Puerto Rico is always on that list of, in terms of a population, a certain segment of that population that claims pride in being the whitest of those islands, the furthest of, see, that's that Bronx chuckle. Just the flashbacks of, and so that for me was also, it was, and at this time, the University of Puerto Rico was known as an elite space, right? For decades, that is what UPR is. And so again, to have a representative of Haiti be invited and to speak knowledgeably about Haiti, and he is ostensibly introducing Haiti, and at the same time, navigating what he will say and won't say about the United States was fascinating to me.
We should focus a little bit here. You're the editor of the Afro-Latinx Futures series at Suny Press. Talk a little bit about that series and some of the books that have been published in it so far, besides yours.
It is. I'm so incredibly excited. That also was an outgrowth of the success of Diasporic Blackness. When that book certainly came out in paperback, and you have played a great part in that, truly. So thank you for that, because people continue to learn about that book, continue to learn about Abdullah Schomburg's life. But what happens was that when the paperback was coming out, I approached the Schomburg Center because they do annual celebrations of Mr. Schomburg's birthday on January 24th. And so that was at an affordable price point, and I said, hey, we can, I write in a certain manner because I want everyone to read my work. That's really important to me. And so we had a book launch that on his birthday, and the new acquisitions editor, Rebecca Colesworthy, she had just come on. This was not her project, right? My editor had left. She comes on October 2017. She decides to come down from Albany to New York City just to be a part of this. And she was like tweeting and she was talking. And I was like, because that's how many editors have you worked with? That is a very rare quality, particularly if an editor is excited about something that they did not share.
Right.
And so I talked to her and I just adored her energy. And I said, man, if you ever want to do anything on Afro-Latinidad, and she immediately was like, yes, period. And I had actually pitched that idea to two other editors at both at Suny Press and at another press. And both of those folks were like, nah. And so for me, it was a great life lesson, because one, it was about, you want to talk about leaning into the yes. And you want to talk about also not having to convince anybody of anything, right? When it's a right match, they'll recognize the value of it. And to her great credit, Rebecca came to Suny Press specifically for her. She had charged herself with identifying up and coming scholars of color who were doing interesting work and who wanted to greenlight other folks' work. And so mine is just one of a series of things that she shepherds at Suny Press. And so I give her credit because I pitched it. She immediately said yes. She then, between the time she said yes on that call, and then I think I had a follow-up email. I was like, what's the next steps? What are the proposals? She had already run the idea by the co-director. He had said yes. And so the purpose of that series is to center Blackness in Latin America and the Caribbean and in the diaspora communities here in North America, right? In all fields of study, i.e. humanities and social, not all, humanities and social sciences. And we do translations, we do monographs and edited volumes. And so what we have coming, in addition to my work Haiti was really the focus of the first three books. Mine was the third that came out in December 2020. The first was the two simultaneous books that came out was a translation of The Immortals by a Haitian author named Mackenzie Orcel, which is a fascinating novel, one of the first novels that gave voice to those who had lived through the earthquake of 2010.
Yeah.
And then we also have an anthropological study on Dominican voodoo, right? That's the second book that comes out. Then we had my book came out. We have a book on Brazil, on Black Brazil, that came out by me, Afolabi. We have a book coming out in June that's looking at Blackness in Puerto Rico in the 19th into like 1965. We have Philip Kazari is coming with his expansion of this chapter, and looking at enslavement and how it figures in films throughout the region. And so, I mean, it's getting good. I mean, it's one of those things where like, I know what's in the pipeline, and I'm like, yes.
Vanessa, I already knew how brilliant and impactful you were, but in prepping for this, second conversation now on Left of Black, and looking at the body of work that you've produced, and now looking at this edited series, you've been at CUNY now for 14 years, and you have made a very conscious decision to lay your roots at a public university that in many ways is disparaged even amongst other public universities, not only in the state of New York like SUNY, but obviously nationally, right? And so much of that has to do with the population that it serves, obviously who folks don't want to see as potential scholars, right? And movers and shakers or in other fields. How important has it been for you to maintain a space there in New York City with that population, to still be able to have a very prolific and productive and impactful, career as a scholar?
I thank you so much for that. Yeah, it is. I want to share an anecdote with you. I remember when they had contacted me about Diasporic Blackness, and they had come from one of our esteemed universities of this land, and they had a certain perspective on what I possibly could do, and then then they read the book, and they came back and they said that was a very good book. And I just it was funny to me, because I also wanted to say, wow, you are showing
right,
what you
right,
think.
right.
Because here's the reality as well is, yeah, there's some of us who are very committed to the not only the cities in which we are born. I'm very blessed. That's why I joke with you, right? Born and raised here in New York City, right? In the Bronx, New York. Got the education that I got. I'm a first generation college graduate student, all the things, right? I went to Yale University. I met with, that third year where I was I knew I was leaving Yale with a degree, but I knew I couldn't do it in 4. We're going to have to cut this down. And this is where serendipity, luck, fate, whatever cuts into play, because then you have a visiting professor named William Luis from Vanderbilt who is teaching that year, and he recruits me to go to Vanderbilt. And then I get there, and then I get to do, so I'm very blessed to both have been trained in these elite spaces, and at the same time, never forget where I come from. And certainly I know what the feeling of liberation is when I walk into a classroom and I see faces that look like me, right? And it is something that, I read the accounts, I hear the stories by friends and colleagues who are working at predominantly white institutions, and I don't share certain experiences, because those students, they want to learn. Those degrees are meaningful. These are folks who have families, whether it's the families they're born into, the families they've created. These are folks who are, the City University of New York's annual tuition is about $14,000.
Wow.
And yet we have students, of course, who can't afford that. Right. We have students who, and that's within, I'm thinking of the senior colleges and specifically, but, these are there are studies year after year that talk about how, in terms of social mobility, in terms of economic mobility, in terms of the system that gets students from the working class into the middle class, and that is the City University of New York. And so it is a very underutilized and overlooked, as huge as it is, it's 500,000 students in this. And a workforce of over 125,000, right? It's huge within the city. And yet, what we do as individual colleges, what we do as a system is completely overlooked. And so, yeah, what I have here is the freedom to be prolific, quite frankly, because I don't know if I had been at Duke, and I imagine that Duke's tenure, what is needed for tenure, is if it's not 2 books or 1 book and plus 5 articles, whatever. I didn't have that at City, so I have the freedom to be as prolific as I am, and that's deeply important. And I have the freedom to be teaching relevant material to students who soak it up, and I can see in real time what's happening. I can see in real time how certain things land. And sometimes as scholars, we really get in the weeds, or we question the importance. Like, it's fascinating to us, and we question how it impacts. And I live 10 minutes away from the Schomburg Center. So that is what being at City College, and that is what living where I am, that's how it has impacted my life, because I have immediate feedback on what I'm doing. And it is not, I don't take it for granted. It is actually my 15th year. I started in 2007. So this year marks 15 years in this space, which is unimaginable to me, quite frankly. It's gone really fast.
What's next for you, Vanessa?
More books coming from Afro-Latinx Futures, certainly. I'm currently the Dean of the Honors College in CUNY, and that in and of itself, Macaulay Honors College is a space that offers an honors education for students, whereby they get a tuition waiver. So that 14 grand I was just talking about,
right? It's a big deal.
It's huge, right?
Big deal. Right.
So, and they are students at 8 of the schools throughout the system. Actually, they are Macaulay at, and I'm going to give shout outs, forgive me. So Macaulay at Brooklyn College, Baruch College, City College, College of Staten Island, Hunter College, Lehman, Queens, and John Jay. And so we have students across the board, and I've been meeting with those students across the 8 colleges. So at the moment, that is what I'm involved in. I'm involved with, I'm the face of honors education at the City University of New York. And so those of you who are aware of how honors itself is conceptualized as an exclusive space, as an elite space, I will tell you what a joy it is to see, again, students of color, not predominantly, to be fair, but there's a significant
mix
group of students of color, Black and Latinx, who they have to maintain a 3.5 average, who they have an experiential learning requirement whereby they have to do an internship or a research assistantship, or they study abroad. They have to do community service. These are the future leaders of New York City.
Right.
And it is such a joy to see these honors students and what it is to be an honors college within this public university system. And so, yeah, I mean, there's that, there's always more to come. I promise I'll keep you posted.
Vanessa, it is always a joy to talk with you. We were joined today on Left of Black by Professor Vanessa K. Valdés, excuse me. She is the Dean of the Macaulay Honors College at the City University of New York, where she's also Professor of Spanish and Portuguese and the former Director of the Black Studies program at CUNY. She's the author of several books: Ocean's Daughters, A Search for Womanhood in the Americas, Suny Press 2014, The Great Diasporic Blackness, The Life and Times of Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, Suny Press 2017. And she joined us today to talk about her latest collected edition, Racialized Visions, Haiti and the Hispanic Caribbean, published by Suny Press as part of the Afro-Latinx Futures series, edited by Professor Valdés herself. Thanks again for joining us.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.